Group leaders, grow group leaders or life group leaders or whatever you call yourselves. We are making great progress. We're into week 4, and I want to thank you for just how well you are all doing. I keep hearing feedback both at Father's House and at Olive Tree. To be honest, I haven't really heard direct feedback from The Rock if you're joining us from that church. But the feedback I am hearing from both churches that I am engaging with is that you guys are leading these conversations brilliantly, that you're working hard, that you're being brave, that you're setting up these difficult conversations, and that people are growing and that there's fruit. So thank you so much. We're sort of toothless without you guys. We can dream up all these ideas and shoot all these films, but unless you grab hold of this stuff and run with it, it does nothing. So thank you, well done, great job. The first thing I want to do is just make a suggestion. I'm not sure if you've done this in your life group yet or not, but in the emails that you received right up front with the first pack, there was a kind of blue section at the bottom of that email entitled Some Discussion Guidelines. And I kind of sat down and spent some time just laying out what I felt like was the logic of this new paradigm, this new way of doing relationships. And in a couple of the life groups I've been in, the leaders have ended up reading that out, which I never thought to tell you to do. And it's been powerful every time they've done that. So if you have, please don't reinvent the wheel. You've done a great job. If that hadn't occurred to you, like it hadn't occurred to me, can I suggest that I've seen it work really well? And so it's the part that says, God gave all of us power over ourselves. Powerful people know that they and only they can control themselves. They can choose to love others, say yes and no and mean it, choose their relationships and what to pour the resources of their lives into. Powerful people are free and they allow others to be free around them. When I connect to the perfect love of God, my identity becomes secure. This drives down fear in me. When fear is reduced in me, I no longer need to control others. I can take responsibility to control myself and create freedom for others. Cultivating connection with others and the sort of emotive experience of love is only possible in an environment of freedom. Therefore, our connection is only possible in an environment of freedom, and I'll only be brave enough to give you freedom when I'm perfectly connected to the love of God, which makes me feel secure and allows me to resist the temptation to control you. Perfect love drives out fear. In the absence of fear, deep connection is possible. Connection is the only bridge I have to truly influence you. The reason I'm suggesting you read this now is this line here, because we're going to start getting into quite a radically uncontrolling way of doing relationship, and people are immediately going to start asking, well, then how would I influence someone else? What if they are just doing something that's wrong? This is the answer to that. Connection is the only bridge I have to truly influence others without resorting to trying to control them. Connection is the experience of knowing and being known. The greater the connection, the more influence we have. And then this last bit speaks to where we finish, which is on boundaries. Intimacy is different from connection. Intimacy is the amount of access I give you to my resources and my deepest needs. For intimacy to work, we need to value one another's resources and consistently seek to meet one another's needs. If one party no longer values the resources of my life and or consistently refuses to meet my emotional needs, I have the freedom to downgrade the level of intimacy and enforce boundaries. I kind of agonized over every one of those words and sentences because I believe that that is the kind of sum total of the thinking that's going on here. So I really do suggest that you have a read. Please mail me or get in touch with us if any of that stuff doesn't quite make sense or you have some good questions around that. I'd love to try and set you up with some kind of answers to those questions so that when you're getting into this stuff, you can read it with conviction. Right. Now, another thing to do before I get into the specifics of week 4, I want to give you an idea of where we're going. Because week 4 and 5 connect quite closely to one another, and week 6 and 7 connect quite closely to one another. And there will be instances where people are asking questions, particularly in week 4, that you are able to say will be answered in week 5 or will be answered in week 6. So to give you a broad idea, week 4 and 5 are on communication, on how to communicate in ways that deepen connection. So week 4, the one that you're dealing with this coming week, is Amy speaking about a really radical way of doing communication, this assertive way of doing communication, where I only commit to telling you what's going on inside of me, and I don't get to judge or correct or have an opinion about what's going on inside of you. And communication which seeks to reach understanding as opposed to agreement is the only kind of communication that builds connection. Listening to that lot, you might immediately think, wow, but what if this person is just genuinely wrong or genuinely hurting me or genuinely needs to change? As much as it's fine to hear on a video that we shouldn't be trying to control or change one another, immediately a bunch of people in your life group will be thinking of people that they do want to change, and possibly for good reason. What do we do then? And you are able to say, hold that thought. Next week, we're going to talk about how to actually go about getting your needs met. And the following week, we're going to talk about how to set boundaries in place when people really are hurting each other. So we start on the kind of extreme end of what love looks like in its most uninterrupted form. And then we're going to start to add details to what you do when, as you keep your love on towards people, they choose to not meet your needs or they choose to abuse the resources of your life, as is mentioned in that opening statement. That if they consistently don't meet my needs, how do I communicate better to them so that they do know what my needs are? If they consistently abuse the resources of my life, how do I set some boundaries in place so that that no longer happens? So I just want you to know that week 4 and 5 on communication, week 6 and 7 on boundaries and levels of intimacy and how to manage the amount of access you give people so that they don't hurt you with it or damage themselves with that access. Right, now to week 4, Amy does a great job. Amy Roger, Ross Rogers' wife, speaks about how we can do communication in a bunch of really unhealthy ways that increase anxiety, and the one way to do communication that will drive anxiety down and foster connection between one another. The whole thing is fairly self-explanatory. The first question will be a fun one to try and force people not to just give you the Sunday school answer, which is when we say, what do you think of this whole idea of fighting for understanding as opposed to agreement? A bunch of us might be tempted to say, yeah, understanding, I'm for that. But just probe a little deeper, because as sure as eggs is eggs, your people in your group do fight for agreement a huge amount of the time. And so you're going to want to have some ideas from your own life of where you do that. Then the next one, I just want to give you a heads up, something about our South African pioneer, Boermakaplan kind of society seems to reward aggression and action over passive kind of waiting around and being fearful. We think if you're going to err in either direction, it's better to err in the direction of fight versus the idea of flight. And so when you start asking which communication style have you primarily adopted, aggressive, passive-aggressive, or assertive, most people will probably like to think of themselves as erring on the side of aggression and erring on the sides of being over-confrontational. But what we actually know is that almost all of us hate confrontation. We are consistently bad at it, and the vast majority of us avoid as far as possible. And so just be prepared to push your people on that idea a little bit. Some of them may change their diagnosis of themselves. They'll start out by saying, I'm too confrontational, and I err on the side of aggressive as opposed to passive. And yet there will be examples in almost everyone's life, I imagine, where they have gone the passive-aggressive route, or just totally passive, as opposed to going aggressive like they'd like to think. That's just a weird thing about South Africa. I suspect Canada is on the opposite end of the spectrum, and everyone errs on the side of being passive there. But we, and they would probably admit that. They'd probably kind of think that's a good thing to be on the side of being too passive. We think it's better to be on the side of being too aggressive, but we're kidding ourselves a lot of the time. Right, then just to kind of wrap up week 4, where you're going to end up with is this strange idea that I can only love you properly if I'm prepared to love myself properly. I can only value what's going on inside you when I'm prepared to value and understand what's going on inside me. It's not a kind of second prize that God said, well, love others as you love yourself. God didn't just settle for the fact, well, I can't help but have them love themselves. They won't stop doing that, so I might as well just work with what I've got. God designed you to have a healthy sense of love for yourself, proper love for yourself, as a forgiven, righteous, destined human being, destined for greatness and for glory, chosen for a reason, given gifts and talents and ability to meet other people's needs. There's something glorious in you. And there's sort of false self-love. There's weird pride and ego, which I almost always find is actually built on a foundation of insecurity. And then there's genuine self-love that can be quite humble, because we realize we didn't earn the good things that are in us. And until I can accept that there's value inside me, that there's good stuff here for me to offer in relationships, that there are treasures here that are worth protecting and stewarding, that my heart is actually good, which is why it's worth guarding, as the Proverbs tell us. Until I can accept that, and take some responsibility for communicating to you what the good things are that are in here, and communicating to you the needs that I have in order to protect this thing and keep it healthy, my internal space. Until I start to realize that my time with God, my time doing some exercise, my time being healthy, my time improving my own abilities, my energy level so that I can pour the resources of my life into the good things that I've chosen to give myself to, until I start to accept that those things are important, that they matter, I will either overcompensate and try to dominate you and say you don't matter, or I'll undercompensate and be passive and say that only you matter. And that was the whole big point out of this session, that assertive relationships, assertive communication rather, that builds good relationships is based on this idea that I matter and so do you. You matter deeply. I care a huge amount about you. In fact, I care so much about you that I care about you as much as I care about myself, that the two are equal. And so both of us in this relationship need to be blessed. Both of us need to be choosing to be in this relationship. And if at any point that goes out of whack and one of us starts to think that the other one is more important, me or you, then we end up being passive or aggressive or passive-aggressive. And so I'd love for you to try and think that concept through and ask that question as many different ways as you need to have your people start to think, could it be that I can only love you properly when I'm prepared to love myself properly? That I can only understand and meet your needs when I'm prepared to take my own needs seriously enough to figure out how to articulate them? To start taking the dipstick that Amy was speaking about in the video and watching it change color and actually figure out what's going on inside me. And for us thinkers, I've said this enough times in the coaching videos, I'm a words guy and a thinking type of guy, and it takes ages for me to figure out what emotions are actually going on inside me. One of the best ways I can love the people I'm in relationships with is to take seriously what's actually going on inside me. So often you end up in these relationships where you're like, they're not giving me what I need, they're not giving me what I need, they're being horrible to me, they're holding out on me, they're whatever, and we start to rage. You end up in your boss's office complaining about something. And if anyone were to just stop you and say, what is it that you need? I'm not always sure that we'd have great answers for that. Okay, stop all the flapping and complaining and all the blaming and so on. What do you actually need? It's quite a difficult question to answer a lot of the time. I can't be in great relationships. I can't really honor you if I'm not prepared to figure out what my needs really are, and then put just as much energy into trying to figure out what your needs really are. That's this whole thing of understanding, not agreement, understanding. And that's what we're going for. So I hope all of that is helpful. One final thought, just a quote that I find super handy when we're talking about conflict type communication when things get a little out of control, is that scared people are scary. Scared people are scary. And so when you're having this discussion about how to communicate in ways that build connection, you may well be getting a bunch of responses from your group where they're talking about how these different people in my life communicate in such nasty ways to me. They do the aggressive thing. They don't go passive. I wish they'd go passive. It's very powerful to be able to tell your people that the most scary ones in their life, the ones who are the most aggressive, the T-Rexes, are only doing that because they're deeply insecure. Scared people are scary. Secure people aren't scary at all. The ones who are most confident are the ones who need to tell you least why they are so confident in themselves. So I hope that helps. Enjoy your session.